This vessel will be built or procured from a Dutch company, Dharma. Can he say to me why he's not backing British industry, like my right honourable friend for Worley said, that this will be £10 million contract which will go to a Dutch yard rather than being spent in the UK?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman's already decided how a competition will end, and that's unwise. We do have multiple potential providers of a vessel that needs to have already been built. So we're going through a buying process. We'll see how that procurement exercise ends.
Philip Dunn. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I commend my honourable friend for the care which he's taking in dealing with the challenges from the Ajax contract and the transparency which he's approaching the House in keeping us up to date with the problems. Would he agree with me that the production contract, which was entered into in 2014, was done was characterised by transferring risk onto the contractor? Had we followed the practices of the previous Labour government, trumpeted by the Shadow Secretary of State, the risk would have stayed with the Ministry of Defence and the taxpayer. Too long, Philip.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. If this had been a Nimrod situation where £3.7 billion was wasted by the last government and they attempt to blame it on us, that would have been where we are. We're not. We have a firm price contract with General Dynamics.
Joanna Chung.
Mr. Speaker, Redford Barracks in my constituency has had another stay of execution to 2025. But as the UK government seem unmoved by arguments to retain the defence estate in Scotland, will the Minister consider transferring the land at Redford to the City of Edinburgh Council so as to offset some of the economic impact of the closure of the barracks?
Thursday.
The Honourable Lady I think fails to recognise that we have moved already headquarters 51 Brigade to Redford Barracks. Large parts of Redford Barracks will be retained, and also Glen Course, which was due to obviously reduce, is going to increase and be retained on that site. So the investment into Scotland of new bases or securing existing bases is incredibly important.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From foot and mouth to floods to the pandemic, our armed forces have always stepped up in civilian emergencies, but the lessons have always been that this needs to be as early as possible. From recent experiences with Storm Arwen, would my honourable friend agree with me that measures need to be put in place across all levels of government so that the armed forces can be deployed in civilian emergencies locally, strategically and quickly?
Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, and indeed we do have those mechanisms already with liaison officers in every local resilience fora. The Armed Forces do an amazing job, whether it be responding to flooding or indeed last month alone, Mr. Speaker, delivering 521,700 jabs as part of the booster programme.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a fellow trade unionist, Jack Dromey was a dear friend. His final fight in this place was for Afghan refugees, 13,000 of which are languishing in hotels, not exactly a warm welcome. So can the Defence Secretary say exactly how he's deploying Defence Estate and Annington Homes to ensure that we hope these refugees?
The honourable member makes a very important point, and I would ask all members of this House to reach out to their local authorities, because a lot of local authorities' words has not been matched by action. I've made available nearly 500 Marriott quarters to those individuals. Of course, very few local authorities were prepared to take up those available Marriott quarters in which to keep those refugees. I think it's important that we all get the local authorities to pull together alongside the rest of the government.
Okay, that ends questions. Before I call the Secretary of State to make his statement, I have to express once again my disappointment that the important announcements have been made first to the media rather than to this House. In this case, I accept that the issues of market sensitivity meant the announcements had to be made this morning. However, I am told the announcement were required because of speculation about the policy change over the weekend. That speculation appears to have been substantially accurate, which means that the media appears to have known the details before this House. If that is the case, I would be grateful if the Secretary of State could confirm that a leak inquiry is to be held. I now call the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Secretary of State Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to update the House on building safety. But before I do so, I can confirm that I have asked the Permanent Secretary at my department to conduct a leak inquiry. It was a matter of considerable regret to me that details of the statement that I'm about to give were shared with the media before they were shared with members of this House and indeed those most affected. It's worth pausing at the start of any statement to reflect on why building safety is an issue of concern to all of us in this House today. It took the tragedy at Grenfell Tower on 14th of June 2017, as a result of which 72 innocent men, women and children lost their lives, to put building safety properly on the political agenda. Families were living in a building that was literally a death trap because of failures of enforcement and compliance in our building safety regime. And this government must take its share of responsibility for those failures. And over 4 years on from that terrible tragedy, it is clear that the building safety system remains broken. The problems that we have to fix have been identified by many across this House from all parties. And I'd like at this point also to register my appreciation of the work that the late Jack Dromey did on this issue. He was Shadow Housing Minister for 3 years, and both as a trade unionist and as Member of Parliament for Birmingham Erdington, he did a great deal to bring to light the plight of those who were affected by this crisis. As we know, there are still a small number of high-rise buildings with dangerous and unsafe cladding which have to be fixed. Secondly, we know that those who manufactured dangerous products and developed dangerous buildings have faced inadequate accountability so far and shown insufficient contrition. We also need to ensure that we take a proportionate approach in building assessments overall. There are too many buildings today which are declared unsafe, and there are too many who've been seeking to profit from that current crisis. And fourth and most importantly, leaseholders are shouldering a desperately unfair burden. They're blameless, and it is morally wrong that they should be the ones asked to pay the price. I'm clear about who should pay the price for remedying failures. It should be the industries who profited as they caused the problem and those who continue to profit as they make it worse. And Mr. Speaker, we'll take action on all of these fronts. To ensure that every remaining high-rise dangerous building has the necessary cladding remediation to make it safe, we will open up the next phase of the Building Safety Fund early this year and focus relentlessly on making sure it is risk-driven and delivered more quickly. We will also ensure that those who profited and continue to profit from the sale of unsafe buildings and construction products must take full responsibility for their actions and pay to put things right. Those who knowingly put lives at risk should be held to account for their crimes. And those who are seeking to profit from the crisis by making it worse should be stopped from doing so. Today, I'm putting them on notice. To those who missold dangerous products like cladding or insulation, to those who cut corners to save cash as they developed or refurbished people's homes, and to those who sought to profiteer from the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, we are coming for you. I have established a dedicated team in my department to expose and pursue those responsible. We'll begin by reviewing government schemes and programmes to make sure that in accordance with due process, there are commercial consequences for any company which is responsible for this crisis and refusing to help to fix it. In line with this, just before Christmas, I instructed Homes England to suspend Ryden Homes, which is closely connected to the company that refurbished the Grenfell Tower, from its participation in the Help to Buy scheme with immediate effect. And I also want to welcome the decision by the Mercedes Formula One team and Toto Wolff to discontinue sponsorship from Kingspan, the cladding firm, with immediate effect. The voices of the families of the bereaved and the survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire were heard, but this is only the start of the action that must be taken. And Mr. Speaker, we must also restore common sense to the assessment of building safety overall. The government's clear. We've got to find ways for there to be fewer unnecessary surveys. Medium-rise buildings are safe unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. There must be far greater use of sensible mitigations like sprinklers and fire alarms in place of unnecessary and costly remediation work. So to achieve that, I'm withdrawing the government's consolidated advice note today. It's been wrongly interpreted, and it's driven a cautious approach to building safety in buildings that are safe that goes beyond what we consider necessary. And we are supporting new proportionate guidance for assessors, developed by the British Standards Institution, which will be published this week. Second, we will press ahead with the Building Safety Fund, adapting it so that it is consistent with our proportionate approach. And we will set a higher expectation now that developers must fix their own buildings. And will give leaseholders more information at every stage of the process. And thirdly, before Easter, we'll be implementing our scheme to indemnify building assessors conducting external wall assessments, giving them the confidence to exercise their balanced professional judgment. And we will audit those assessments to make sure that expensive remediation is only being advised where it is necessary to remove a threat to life. I'll be working closely with lenders over the coming months to improve market confidence, and I've asked my colleague Lord Greenhouse to work with insurers on new industry-led approaches that bring down the premiums facing leaseholders. Further, we'll take the power to review the governance of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors to make sure that they are equipped properly to support a solution to this challenge. Those in the industry who refuse to work with us in good faith to take a more proportionate approach should be clear about our determination to fix the problem for all those caught up in this crisis. Finally, we must relieve the burden which has been unfairly placed on leaseholders. And I want to pay tribute to all those across the House who've campaigned so passionately on this subject. They know the injustice of asking leaseholders, very often young people who have saved hard and made sacrifices to get their first steps on the housing ladder, to pay money they don't have to fix a problem they didn't cause, all while the firms that made a profit on those developments sit on their hands. So we'll take action to end this scandal and protect leaseholders. We will scrap the proposal for loans and long-term debt for medium-rise leaseholders. I can confirm today to the House that no leaseholder living in a building above 11 metres will ever face any costs for fixing dangerous cladding. And, working with members of both Houses, we will pursue statutory protection for leaseholders, and nothing will be off the table. As part of this, we'll introduce immediate amendments to the Building Safety Bill to extend the right of leaseholders to challenge those who cause defects in premises up to 30 years retrospectively. And we will also take further action immediately. We'll provide an additional £27 million to fund more fire alarms so we can end the dreadful misuse of waking watches. We will change grant funding guidance so that shared owners affected by this crisis can more easily sublet their properties and encourage lenders and landlords to approve subletting arrangements. And in the period before long-term arrangements are put in place, I will work with colleagues across government to make sure leaseholders are protected from forfeiture and eviction because of historic costs. Innocent leaseholders must not shoulder the burden. We've already committed £5.1 billion of taxpayers' funding from this government, but we should not now look to the taxpayer for more funding. We should not ask hard-working taxpayers to pay more taxes to get developers and cladding companies making vast profits off the hook. We'll make industry pay to fix all of the remaining problems and to help to cover the range of costs facing leaseholders. Those who manufactured combustible cladding and insulation, many of whom have made vast profits even at the height of the pandemic, they must pay now instead of leaseholders. We've made a start through the residential property developer tax and the building safety levy, both announced last February, but we'll now go further. I will today be writing to developers to convene a meeting over the next few weeks, and I'll report back to the House before Easter. We will give them the chance to do the right thing. I hope that they will take it, but I can confirm to the House today that if they do not, then if necessary, we will impose a solution upon them in law. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must never be in this position again. So we're putting the recommendations of the Hackett Review on building safety in law, and we will shortly commence the Fire Safety Act. We're also today publishing new collaborative procurement guidance on removing the incentives for industry to cut corners and to help stop the prioritisation of cost over value. And we will legislate to deliver broader reforms to the leasehold system as well. We will also bring forward measures to fulfil commitments made in the Social Housing White Paper, so that when parliamentary time allows, we will have legislation on social housing regulation so social housing tenants cannot be ignored as those in the Grenfell community were for many years. 4.5 years on from the tragedy of Grenfell, it is long past time that we fix this crisis. And through the measures that I've set out today, we will seek redress for past wrongs and secure funds from developers, from construction product manufacturers, and we will protect leaseholders today and fix the system for the future. And I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Secretary of State Lisa Nandy.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for your kind words about Jack Dromey, who should have been with us here today. There is a space over there that I know Jack would have occupied. Back in the 70s, horrified by the spectacle of a skyscraper in London that lay empty while people slept rough underneath it, Jack was one of those who occupied Centrepoint Tower in protest. He was never afraid to speak truth to power, and I hope that today marks the start of all of us across the House invoking his spirit, because 4.5 years after the appalling tragedy at Grenfell, and a road paved with broken promises and false dawns. Hundreds of thousands are still trapped in unsafe homes, millions are caught in the wider crisis, and the families of 72 people who lost their lives are waiting for justice. So it's a relief that we finally have a consensus that the developers and manufacturers who profited from this appalling scandal, not the victims, should bear greater costs, and that blameless leaseholders must not pay. After a year of hell of the prospect hanging over leaseholders, we welcome the decision to remove the threat of forced loans. But can the Secretary of State tell us what makes him think that he can force developers who for 4 years have refused to do the right thing to pay up? We've been told there's a March deadline and a round table, but there isn't a plan. If he has one, can we hear it? Because he will find an open door on this side of the House if he has a credible proposal to bring. Today he warned developers that if negotiation fails, our backstop, what we can do, he said, is increase taxation on those responsible. But that isn't quite right, is it? I have here the letter from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and can I remind him what it says? He was told, you may use a high-level threat of tax or legal solutions in discussions with developers, but whether or not to impose or raise taxes remains a decision for me, the Chief Secretary, and is not a given at this point. The thing is, Mr Speaker, if I've seen this letter, I'm fairly sure that the developers have too. And it appears, furthermore, that what he's told the public, that tax rises are the backstop, is not what he has told the Treasury. This letter says, you have confirmed separately that DL-UHC budgets are a backstop for funding these proposals in full, should sufficient funds not be raised from industry. Now, that is not what the Secretary of State told the House a moment ago. So can he clear this up? Has the Chancellor agreed to back a new tax measure if negotiations fail? Or is he prepared to see his own already allocated budgets, levelling up funding, or monies for social or affordable housing raided? Or is his plan to go back to the Treasury and renegotiate and legislate if he fails in March? And if that is the case, Mr Speaker, it will take months. And there is nothing to stop freeholders from passing on the costs to leaseholders in the meantime. Has he even got an assessment of how many leaseholders will be hit with whacking great bills if he delays? So, Mr Speaker, if he's serious about going after the developers, and I hope that he is, why isn't he putting these powers into the Building Safety Bill now? Because the only trick that he's got up his sleeve, as he just confirmed to the House, is to ban them from Help to Buy. And we know that the impact of that work, though welcome, will be marginal. Can he see the problem? He'll also know that there's a gaping hole in what he's proposed. A significant number of buildings have both cladding and non-cladding defects, and leaseholders in them face ruinous costs to fix things like missing fire breaks and defective compartmentation. Mr Speaker, you cannot make a building half safe. Given that he recognises the injustice of all leaseholders caught up in the building safety crisis, why is he abandoning those who are hit with bills for non-cladding defects? And why will he not amend his bill so that all leaseholders are protected from historic defects in law? The truth is that the pace of remediation has been painfully slow. He is now on track to miss the deadline to fix all Grenfell-style cladding by over half a decade. And there are huge delays when it comes to Building Safety Fund applications. So will he get a grip on what is going on in his own department and ensure that the progress of remediation is accelerated markedly? Because for affected leaseholders, as he knows, this has been a living nightmare, and we owe it to them to bring it swiftly to an end. Mr Speaker, what he's given us today is a welcome shift in tone and some new measures that we on this side of the House very much hope will succeed. But the harder I look at this, the less it stands up. We were promised justice and we were promised change to finally do right by the victims of this scandal. And that takes more than more promises. It takes a plan.
Stay.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Secretary of State for her questions. First of all, can I entirely agree with the generous and fitting words that she had for Jack Dromey. As I mentioned briefly in my statement, he was a relentless campaigner for social justice throughout his career, and indeed the role he played, in particular, in highlighting the plight of the homeless and the need to act in order to ensure that they had a safe and decent place to live, is one of the many achievements that we will all record as we think of his contribution. Can I also welcome the consensual approach that she is taking and our front bench are taking to seeking to ensure that we place responsibility where it truly lies. And she had a number of appropriate questions to follow up in order to ensure that we deliver effectively. She made the point with respect to the Building Safety Fund that the allocations so far have been slow and we're behindhand, and that's true. I think it's always better to be honest about those areas where government has not performed as well as it should. And one of the first things that I did as Secretary of State when I arrived was to ask for all the steps necessary to be taken in order to ensure that that money was spent effectively. One of the problems that we've had is, of course, that it's a demand-led system, so we've relied on many of those who have been responsible as the individual owners of buildings to come forward. But one of the things we're also hoping to do is to ensure that, working with the National Fire Chiefs Council, that we have the most extensive analysis of all of the buildings that do need our support and that we accelerate work on BSF. So her concerns are not misplaced, and it is certainly my intention to ensure that we accelerate and make comprehensive that work. She also made the point that non-cladding costs do need to be met, and I agree. And she specifically requested that we provide amendments to the Building Safety Bill in order to ensure that there was statutory protection for leaseholders. That is our intention. We intend to bring forward those amendments, and I look forward to working with her and colleagues across the House in order to provide the most robust legal protection. She also doubted, and again I can understand the basis of her scepticism, whether or not developers, given their past behaviour, and indeed others in industry, given their past behaviour, would necessarily come sweetly to the table. And that is why it is so important that we have a range of tools available. I think it's important to recognise that there are some developers and some in the industry who have done the right thing. And it's also important to recognise that a spokesman for the House Builders Federation, Stuart Baisley, today struck a very constructive and open tone. But we do need to have additional backstops, and it is clear that taxes can, if necessary, play a part. I don't want to move there, but we do have the absolute assurance that we can use the prospect of taxation in order to bring people to the table. All taxation decisions are made by the Chancellor. No Chancellor, no Chief Secretary would ever say anything other than that. But the fact that the Chief Secretary and the Chancellor have authorised me to use the prospect of taxation, the fact that we already have taxation through the residential property developer tax, shows that we are prepared to take every step necessary. The final point, I think, which was implicit, perhaps explicit, in everything that the Shadow Secretary of State said, is that we'll be judged on our actions. And I think that is entirely fair. I recognise, given the scale of frustration that so many have felt in the past, that ultimately there can only really be satisfaction when we bring this matter to a conclusion. I believe that today marks a significant step forward, but there is more work to do, and I hope that we can conclude that work on a cross-party basis in order to bring justice to those who deserve it.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottom.
I'll cooperate. Can I say, Mr. Speaker, through you, to the Mother of the House, that the tribute to her husband, Jack Dromey, for his work, for people's interests at work and at home, will be long remembered, together with that of David Amis, who for 20 years worked on the all-party group on fire safety with Ronnie King and others. I believe this is another step forward which is greatly welcomed and greatly needed. I think the extension of the liability of 30 years is wrong for those who knew what they were doing was wrong. 30 years may be fine for those who did it by mistake, but for those who knew what they were doing, there should be unlimited liability both in time and in money. I hope that the Secretary of State will have a round table, if he wants to take over the all-party group one, for a summit on this. You can pick up some of the other issues which no doubt he's been working on, but to keep the statement reasonable, he may not have covered today. One problem are the insurance premiums paid by leaseholders for the property they don't own, which may have gone up from an illustrative £300 a year to £3,000 a year. I believe that the Association of British Insurers should be told that the Competition and Markets Authority will look to see whether there is price gouging, in simple terms, and if there's some kind of catastrophic reinsurance needed, that the government will help them to make communal arrangements to deal with that, because those insurance premiums should come down to the £300 that they were before. The last point of very many I'd like to make is that the Treasury will expect to get the benefit of levy and tax towards the £5 billion already announced, and the contributions which will come in from developers will relieve burdens on residential leaseholders. But the government also gets the VAT on money that's spent, which is 20% of the total cost. If the total cost has come down from 15 billion to, say, 12 billion, my right honourable friend can calculate and discuss with the Treasury how much extra the Treasury is getting. The Treasury should not be making a profit out of all this catastrophe.
Can I thank the Father of the House for his questions, and also say that he is quite right that Sir David Amess, before his sad death, was one of the most prescient and one of the most effective campaigners for improved building safety, and his memory was very much in my mind. The point that the Father of the House makes about the need to look potentially at unlimited liability for those who consciously and deliberately operated in a reckless fashion is one that I will consider, and I'm sure will be considered in the passage of the bill. His point that we should work with others, particularly the broad leasehold community who've done so much to identify the way forward, is absolutely one that we intend to do. The point that he makes about insurance premium is absolutely right, and that is why my noble friend Lord Greenhouse will be talking to Baroness Morgan of Coates and others in the ABI in order to ensure that more insurers like Aviva do the right thing. And I very much note his point about VAT and Treasury contributions, and in the ongoing conversations that we have with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'll reflect the very important point he made.
SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I wish to echo the sentiments around the House to the work Jack Dromey has done on this issue and his campaigning to get justice for those affected. It's been almost 5 years since the Grenfell fire, and in that time we've had 4 housing secretaries and several different policies and approaches to this issue. First the government would pay, then leaseholders would pay, and now developers will pay, all because the Treasury has for so long refused to act further on this issue. This confusion is not only harming homeowners facing a Tory cost of living crisis, but also affecting the ability of devolved governments to plan their responses appropriately. So can the Secretary of State guarantee that this latest policy will be acted upon, and will he commit to working with the devolved governments to provide further clarity? And additionally, can he make clear when already promised funding will fully and finally be delivered to the devolved governments for this matter?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for her points, and we certainly will work with devolved governments. Of course, the residential property developer tax, like all UK-wide taxes, is distributed appropriately in line with the Barnett formula and other requirements, but we will certainly work with devolved governments. And I should say that I'm very grateful to both the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive for the work that they've already done on this issue, and we all have much to learn from one another.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the direction of travel in this statement, specifically that leaseholders will not have to pay for cladding remediation. I'm also glad to see that building products makers are now coming within the scope of government and not only property developers